Let me tell you a story. That is the theme for our service today, and in many ways for next Sunday as well. Let me tell you a story is what we hear in the Scripture over and over again. I remember hearing a Hasidic Orthodox Jewish storyteller in Chicago at a homiletics meeting, a national meeting, who kept all of us in rapt attention several years ago. He could go for an hour telling one story, had it all memorized, and he could do many stories like this. This is how the Bible was passed down in oral tradition, story after story, generation after generation. It's the way Jesus spoke most of the time, telling stories with a hook and a little sting at the end. Let me tell you a story, Jesus would say, out on a hillside or down by the sea. Let me tell you a story is what Joshua is basically doing. And when they lay out the stones and people ask, what do these stones mean? Then you tell a story. It's the hermeneutical question, isn't it? It's the same question the little girl in Sound of Music asks after they sing doe, a deer, a female deer. She says, but what does it mean? And the hermeneutical question for us this morning is, but what do these stones mean? And off we tell and going and telling a story. And Joshua says, tell them when the children ask, what do these stones mean? Tell them about the Exodus and about God liberating the people from Egypt. Just tell them the story. Why do you suppose human beings want to tell stories? Why do you suppose storytelling is so important to us? I would suggest it's because from story we get our identity. We learn who we are as the people of God. We learn who we are in all kinds of ways. I remember my grandpa Carl telling me stories about his Missouri boyhood and growing up and moving to Tulsa, Oklahoma and beginning a construction company there and building houses all over the city of Tulsa. I remember sitting on his back porch there in Tulsa and hearing about what my father was like as a little boy and what he was like growing up. And I began to get a sense of what it meant to be a Carl. I got a sense of my identity from hearing these stories. If you don't know who you are, you won't know how to live. True story about an incumbent president, I won't tell which one, who was scrambling around to find votes anywhere he could find them right before the election. And he came into a retirement community and somehow ended up in an Alzheimer's unit. And the nurse said, Mr. President, you may have to identify yourself. And he said, okay. And he went up to the first lady sitting in a wheelchair, and she was half asleep. And he tapped her on the knee, got down in her face and said, ma'am, do you know who I am? And she said, no, but if you go over to that nurse's station, they'll tell you who you are. When you don't know who you are, you don't know how to live. And story is what tells you who you are and how important it is to get the right story. I remember having a whole group of Greek students over at our home there in Richmond. And at that time, Union Seminary was recruiting students from all over the United States, many from the north, from Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York. And that group happened to be primarily from the north, but there was one from South Carolina. And we were sitting around talking, and I was telling them about visiting Civil War battlefields. In Oklahoma, the closest we got to the Civil War was Pea Ridge, Arkansas. But in Richmond, I mean, there are battlefields all over. Wilderness and Spotsylvania and Chancellorsville, and I was talking about reading Bruce Catton's Stillness at Appomattox and Douglas Southall Freeman's famous 4 volumes, Pulitzer Prize winning volumes on Lee, and I was having so much fun visiting all these battlefields, and I mentioned Chancellorsville, and the one from South Carolina said, oh, Chancellorsville, that's where we lost Stonewall Jackson, isn't it? And the entire room, including myself, turned to him and said, what do you mean we? And he said, Lawsy me, this is the first time I ever talk about the war between the states in mixed company. And he went on to say that his great-great-grandfather had given the prayer of invocation at South Carolina's vote to secede from the Union. So you know how the stories in his family had shaped his identity. Let me tell you a story shapes your identity. And this morning, I want to focus for a bit on the story of IPC. And the first thing to focus on is the story of continuity, which began not just with Henry Edmonds and those early pioneers who left Highland Presbyterian Church and went across the street to Temple Emmanuel. No, this story actually begins with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and Moses and David and Jesus. It's a long story of continuity. It's an important story. Our 100 years is actually pretty short compared to this long story of continuity in which we find ourselves participants. I remember visiting with the Greek Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem as he showed me around Old Jerusalem, every nook and cranny. We even went over to Hebrew Union University and looked at that, and I realized how old some places of worship actually are. Do you know that St. Catherine's Monastery, that is at the foot of Mount Sinai, goes back to the 6th century? I mean, it celebrated in 1965-66, 1,400 years of history, of continuous worship. Justinian planted it there years and years ago. And I remember visiting with the Bedouin servants there, and they said their ancestors were servants 1,400 years ago, and they're still there. So our 100 years, you see, is actually pretty short. But in terms of Birmingham, it's actually pretty long, and it's a wonderful story of continuity. And I am amazed to see the commitment of IPC members and ministers throughout the history as you read Kathy Adams' wonderful work called Forward in Faith. And I hope every single one of you will read this as we celebrate this centennial year. It's a story of continuity that would not have continued without God's grace. It's a story of God's grace, because you know no church is perfect. If you want to find a perfect church, then you just go somewhere else, but good luck finding one. We all make mistakes, and yet there is God picking us up. God saying, I know you're not right on every issue every single time, but I'm here with you. I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to continue to be with you through the end of time. And that is a wonderful, wonderful message. Augustine said, you know, there is good in every evil person and evil in every good one. So none of us is sinless. And no churches. Reinhold Niebuhr talks about collectivities and institutions not able to be sinless. We are all caught up in sin, and yet God's grace picks us up and gets us going again. So the first story of IPC is a story of continuity with God's grace. The second story is a story of community involvement. And it fits exactly what Rabbi Miller was mentioning earlier, where you don't just stay here, you get out into the world. And that's what IPC has done throughout its whole history, its whole 100 years. Community ministries didn't just start 20 or 30 years ago. No, it started from the very beginning. Henry Edmonds was out in the world from the very beginning, downtown preaching. Now, I know that IPC was as slow as any other church integrating this congregation, being open to African Americans, and yet from the very beginning, Henry Edmonds was preaching to blacks and prostitutes right downtown at the Lyric Theater. Lots of people don't realize that African Americans were actually welcome in worship in different parts of the country, even during and after the Civil War. In fact, I have preached a few years ago in a black Presbyterian church that also has whites in it in Roanoke, Virginia. And the pastor is white. And guess what's up front in the stained glass window? It's not Jesus. It's not any of the four gospel writers. It's not any of the apostles. It's a stained glass window of Stonewall Jackson. That's right. Who was a Sunday school teacher in this black Presbyterian church and who was beloved by this congregation. Imagine that. You know, this whole business of segregation in churches is actually a little bit more of a turn of a century regression. And God is the one who unites us. God is the one who wants to bring us together. So God said to IPC, as we were just starting 100 years ago, I'm going to plant you in a synagogue. You're going to start in Temple Emmanuel as a living witness to the whole community that Christianity's first language was not Greek, but Hebrew. And your worshiping at Temple Emmanuel will be a living reminder to the whole city of Birmingham how important the Judeo-Christian tradition is. Yes, IPC, get out there. Get beyond these walls. Get out there in the community. And so we have been involved in whatever it is, Fresh Air Farm, First Light, Habitat Birmingham. We've been out there from the very, very beginning and out on the road, out around the world in mission opportunities in Asia and Africa and Ukraine and South and Central America. And we have been raising up pastors, ministers who come in, generations of them who go into the ministry. We have been supporting churches. We've been out there. So it's not really that new when we say we have a new tagline, you know, at IPC. It's joining God in the world, welcoming our neighbors. Yes, that's a good one, and the session, I hope, will approve it on Tuesday night as the strategic plan brings it. However, it's not really that new. It does represent who we are. How easy it would have been to stay only inside this place and just sing our hymns and pat ourselves on the back and then go home. But no, God has called us from 100 years ago to be out in the community, out in the world. So the second story of IPC is a story of community involvement. The first one is continuity. The second is community involvement. And finally, it's a story of consistency. Again, how easy it would have been to bolt to a fast-growing suburb because, you know, staying in this neighborhood, maybe staying near downtown, you don't get as many people to come and worship. However, we never once yielded to that temptation. We have always seen this location not as a handicap, but as an asset, because these beautiful stained glass windows and this beautiful Gothic sanctuary every single day looks down on the streets and the hustle bustle of the city and says to everyone going by, remember God. Do not forget God in your life. And as you come into this place and worship week after week, you hear that same message. Remember God, even in the quiet, especially in the be still and know that I am God moments, even in the quiet moments when we look at these windows in this beautiful place, we remember God. And that's what we've been doing for 100 years. We have been preaching honestly. We have been worshiping faithfully. We have been singing God's praises. We have been teaching the Bible and growing in our faith and administering God's sacraments and healing the sick and comforting the brokenhearted for 100 years. What a heritage. And yet also what a responsibility. Because we are called to go out, as Rabbi Miller said. We are not called to stay only in here. This service and the next service, which will be the centennial service on October 25th, these are not just homecomings. These are outgoings. Why? Because God has a purpose for IPC. We are here for a reason. We are not just here to sing some hymns. However, that is very important because it fuels us to be able to do what God has called us to do. I love as I go around the country and I hear people say, "Is IPC still down there on Highland Avenue?" I said, "Oh yes, it's still there, still doing the work of the kingdom." And thank God it's still there, because you never know how long you're going to be around. Many of you were here in 1992 when the fire engulfed the flames of these buildings next door, but left this one basically untouched. It was amazing. And people cried all over the city, "Oh no, not old IPC. Don't turn it into the ruins of Fountain Abbey in England." No. And Rabbi Miller was one of the first ones here, I'm told, welcoming everyone back to Temple Emmanuel. You started there, come home and stay and worship until you rebuild your building. And I want to thank you personally and your congregation for supporting us at that crucial moment. How did we live through? How did this sanctuary live through this? You know, you want to look at the beautiful stones outside this sanctuary, and you want to ask, what do these stones mean? Why did God keep this sanctuary? It's that hermeneutical question that we have to answer. It's a second chance, isn't it? It's a near miss. We often have near misses in our lives. We have second chances. We see them throughout the Bible. Joseph, Moses, Jonah didn't appreciate his second chance. Job, Paul, lots of second chances. And now we have an opportunity. What do these stones mean? They mean we need to do something with the second chance that God gave us back in 1992. It's amazing to think of the opportunity we have here. This is a very, very special place. And I want you to know that I am honored to be here serving with this wonderful pastoral staff at this moment where we end one century and we begin another. This place is so precious and so important, not only to the city of Birmingham, but to the whole country. You remember that scene in the movie Chariots of Fire where that famous Scottish Olympic runner gets tripped on one of the races and he tumbles. In the movie, it's almost slow motion, and he gets up and the music builds as he begins to run. The other runners are way ahead, and he runs and he runs and he catches up with them, and he breaks the tape just as he comes to the end, and he collapses in exhaustion, heaving and breathing, and the crowd comes around him, and Sam Mossabini, the famous old trainer, moves the crowd aside and holds him up, and he says, "Oh, you take good care of this one, fellas. You'll not find another one like him anytime soon." What do these stones mean? Well, let me tell you a story of continuity, of community involvement, a story of consistency. That's our story. That's the story of Independent Presbyterian Church, at least part of it. But from this moment on, as we enter a new century, with God's help, you and I, in the coming months and years and decades, will continue to write the story of IPC. Take care of this old historic church, dear friends. You'll not find another one like her anytime soon. To God be the glory from this day forth and forevermore. God bless you all.